you for joining us for our Faith and Literature Faith Forum series. We're really fortunate to have the Reverend Dr. Linda Privitera here with us, and she is going to talk about one of my favorite poets, who is also one of her favorite poets, Ted Kooser. And so I hope you've had a chance to look at the poetry. We're going to put it up on the screen as she discusses it. And take it away, Linda.
Okay, thank you. I titled this Americana, the voice from the middle country, because I think that we've certainly been inundated with voices from Washington or China or whatever for quite a while. And Ted Kooser was born in 1939, so he is not a young man, but he continues to produce poetry every day. He spent most of his life in the insurance industry, rising to the position of vice president of an insurance company. And so I don't think many people expected that this would be a poet who would win the Pulitzer Prize. He would get up early every morning, sort of like Kate does, and do his morning devotions. And he would write for an hour and a half every day. And when maybe the third collection of his poems was published in 2004, he both won the Pulitzer Prize and then became Poet Laureate of the United States. And he was the first poet laureate from the Great Plains, as they call it. If you ask him if he's a poet only of regionalism, that is of the Midwest, as many have said about him, he would say no. He said, I'm a universal poet. I met him at Chautauqua a number of years ago. Chautauqua is a kind of grown-up continuing education church school for people who have a lifelong interest in their faith formation, a lifelong interest in the arts, and a lifelong interest in contemporary issues. It's a residential community that only operates for about 7 or 8 weeks in the summer. It's in northern New York. They have an outstanding bookstore, and I'm always interested in the poets. And I picked up Ted's book because he was to deliver a small lecture on his poetry. And it happened to be Delights in Shadows. And I went to his little talk, and we had a good encounter with each other, and he signed the book. And I left that time feeling that I wanted to know more about him. And so we began a correspondence, mostly because I had used maybe 6 of his poems at different times when I'm conducting funerals for people who don't do church. They're spiritual but not religious. So I'd written him a thank you note to say how much I enjoyed using those poems, and he wrote back and said, well, you might want to read blah, 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 because that's really a sermon of its own. So that's how I began with him. I think also my grandparents were dairy farmers in Iowa, which is one area where Ted went to school. And so I feel as if I have kind of Midwest dirt under my fingernails. So that's another reason why I like him so much. What I'm going to do now is show you a video about him. So this will kind of introduce you to him. As I said, he's 81 now, and he tries to use every day. He said he doesn't want to waste the time he has left. The video was done by Bill Frakes, who was born in Nebraska but operates out of Florida. And this is a portion of his major work called the Nebraska Project. So Owen, if you would play that clip.
I started writing, having fun writing when I was just a little kid in elementary school, and then got really serious about it when I was probably 18 or 19, and have done it ever since. And I've told students that the reason I'm pretty good at this is because I've really been doing it every day for 50 years. I talked to a guy at a lumberyard a number of years ago about horseshoe pitching, and he said that his Uncle Ed had been a tri-state champion horseshoe pitcher. And he said one day, he said to his uncle, he said, Ed, he said, how did you get so good at horseshoes? And Ed said, son, you got to pitch 100 shoes a day. I get up around 4:30 and I try to write till 7. And I just sit with my notebook and kind of doodle in it, make a little journal entry, maybe do a little drawing, and maybe once or twice a month something comes up that is worth my time. The rest of the time I'm failing at being a writer, and when the writing's not going very well, I can always go out and do a little drawing or paint something and so on. So it's being constantly engaged with trying to do something like that. I'm not happy if I'm not writing or painting or making something. Life is too short, and when you get to be 71 years old, it really is too short. So I don't want to waste any time. One of the most marvelous things that happened to me as a writer was a number of years ago, I wrote a poem about field mice moving their nests out of the field into the fence row when the plows are coming around. And it's sort of a little Walt Disney animated film with these little mice with their lanterns and the old mice wailing and being upset by this thing and so on. And anyway, I published this poem somewhere. And shortly after that, a woman wrote to me and said, I will never drive by a plowed field in the spring again without thinking of those mice. And I thought, this is my job. This is what I'm going to do. This is a recent poem written within the last month or so. I had read that Edward Hopper had said that all he wanted to do in his life was to paint light falling on the side of a house. And I got to thinking about that and thinking about a particular house in my background when I was a little boy. And so this poem came out of that. It's called In Passing. As if it were waiting for someone, the house faced the road, its door held open by a little bronze dog, the lace curtains at its windows drawn back and tied, so the parlor must have been warm and yellow with a welcoming light. The siding had been freshly painted a sticky-looking white with green screen windows and the customary battleship gray on the floor of the porch, where 2 plain kitchen chairs were turned to face each other as if prepared for conversation. The grass was recently mowed and clipped by hand around the stones that lined the footpath to the door, and the clippings had been swept away. This happened the last Sunday in May, and to either side of the porch were peonies, droopy with blossoms. And it looked as if someone had recently picked up the petals that had fallen, though more were falling as we passed, petal by petal, in the indifferent, casual manner of peonies. And perhaps someone was standing just inside and watching them fall, almost feeling them fall, and was waiting to come out again now that we had passed, to pick up more of them, one hand packing them like tissues into the other, keeping an eye on the place where the road came toward her, wide and empty, out of the trees.
Okay. So that's an introduction to Ted as a person. He has this wonderful open face and kind of largish ears on a small head. And he has a beautiful way of being attentive, which is the hallmark of his poetry. He's trying to get us to pay attention to the small and everyday things, where there's a metaphor hidden somewhere, that there's a deeper resonance. He is an Episcopalian, and I'll read a quote from him toward the end of this time that we have together. He loves language. He loves his choices of words. And yet his poetry is not difficult to understand at all, because he focuses on simple things and everyday moments. So I've chosen 3 poems from different collections. The first is entitled Mother, from Delights and Shadows. The second is called Splitting an Order, from a book that came out, I think, in 2009, perhaps. And then the last one is a Christmas poem that I like. So I'm going to be presenting to you poems about legacy, about what we hand on to each other and how we absorb those experiences from our past and bring them into our present, about how we behave with that legacy. Splitting an Order is about living out a legacy. And the final piece is about trying to help us stay attuned for the holy in all things and all places. One commentator said of Ted Kooser that he sacralizes the ordinary, that everything he does is a sacrament. Everything he helps us see is a sacrament. He takes it, blesses it by his attention, breaks it open, and then shares it with us. So we are privileged companions, I think, in his world and in our own. He invites us to go deeply into our own. So if we could have the first poem, which is entitled Mother.
Can you see it?
Yes.
Oh, sorry.
All right. Mid-April already. The wild plums bloom at the roadside, a lacy white against the exuberant, jubilant green of new grass and the dusty, fading black of burned out ditches. No leaves, not yet. Only the delicate star-petaled blossoms, sweet with their timeless perfume. You have been gone a month today and have missed 3 rains and one night-long watch for tornadoes. I sat in the cellar from 6 to 8 while fat spring clouds went somersaulting, rumbling east. Then it poured, a storm that walked on legs of lightning, dragging its shaggy belly over the fields. The meadowlarks are back, and the finches are turning from green to gold. Those same 2 geese have come to the pond again this year, honking in over the trees and splashing down. They never nest, but stay a week or 2, then leave. The peonies are up, the red sprouts burning in circles like birthday candles. For this is the month of my birth, as you know, the best month to be born in, thanks to you. Everything ready to burst with living. There will be no more new flannel nightshirts sewn on your old black singer. no birthday card or dressed in a shaky but businesslike hand. You asked me if I would be sad when it happened. And I am sad. But the iris I moved from your house now hold in the dusty, dry fists of their roots, green knives and forks as if waiting for dinner, as if spring were a feast. I thank you for that. Were it not for the way you taught me to look at the world, to see the life at play in everything, I would have to be lonely forever. So what does the poet tell you about himself in this poem?
He misses his mother.
He misses his mother. He's sad. Yeah, or he was sad.
And he had some time to prepare. It wasn't a sudden death. You get
Right.
the idea she would have been sick for a while.
Yep. He's still talking to her.
Mm-hmm.
He has a sense of the thin line between the living and the dead. So he tells you that he's still connected to her and that he's in essence living out her legacy. So what was her legacy to him?
She taught him to love many things, to
To
appreciate.
see beauty in the world,
To look.
to pay attention.
Mm-hmm.
And when he does focus this eagle eye of his, you can tell that there's an artist there as well because he loves color. And he'll very often in his poems talk about the colors of things, whether it was the house poem that he read or whether he's talking about the peonies as red candles emerging from the earth, or the green knives and forks of the other plants. He pays attention to color. It catches his eye. So his mother's legacy to him was to see beauty. And for that, he says that he's companioned now by that. That she taught him to see the world as a beautiful place. And so he has many, I wonder if every time he looks at something so deeply, if he doesn't see a part of his mother. So she's still a living presence to him. It's a living word. It's a living legacy. And it made me think, of course, about what are we leaving behind? What's the mark of our life? And is that mark only on our children? Or from the church's perspective, from the gospel perspective, how do we leave our marks on each other? How do we help each other to see what's important and not to miss it? How do we know that even in this awkward and quirky time, how do we know that we are companioned? And so this poem, I think, is an invitation for us to consider what we look to right now to accompany us. I mean, for me, I'm out looking at these plants on my patio. Ottawa has had over a week of 90 degrees and a couple of days over 100. And I'm trying to grow these little heirloom tomatoes. They're black plum and black cherry tomatoes. So I have to go out and hover over them and water and worry about them. My plants, my gardens are one of the places where I find God's magnificence in creation. And that's one of the pieces that I use to companion myself during this time. I think another thing that Ted talks about is that although there is sadness, that's different for him than loneliness. So what would you say about that, the difference between sadness and loneliness? Linda, you need to unmute.
I think he's sad because his mother is gone,
Yeah.
but he's not lonely because she left with him the sensualness of nature and the beauty of nature and just life in general. So he's not feeling alone. He's feeling sad.
It's wonderful that he would let us in. Into that feeling. He did have cancer in the 90s, and you can read more about his life and his other books and his collaborations and all of his awards and blah, blah, blah on the Poetry Foundation website. Despite a correspondence with a friend over the year or two of his chemotherapy and radiation, he doesn't talk about it in any of his poems. So I think this little piece of his own soul coming forward is a wonderful gift. I am sad.
And it's okay to be sad.
Yeah, yeah. You can be sad, but you don't have to be lonely, he's saying.
Yeah.
Some of us are both from time to time. Okay. Anything else about this poem?
Well, I noticed that you mentioned that he focuses on color a lot, but he's very descriptive in using that color, like the knives and forks of the iris plant, when irises bloom with the leaves, waiting for spring to come. I mean, his analogies or metaphors or whatever you want to call them, it's just bursting with every bit of creation and life. And
especially that storm, right? The way he describes the storm, and you can imagine him hunkering down in the root cellar, waiting for the storm to pass.
Watching the clouds bounce off and drag their bellies on the ground. I know.
Shaky bellies and lightning like legs.
I know.
Very, very descriptive poet.
It also resonated with me when he mentioned the Singer sewing machine.
Yes.
Right back there with my mother with the treadle sewing machine. She was an excellent seamstress, and so I was right there with my mother.
Yes, my mother too. I used to have the old black Singer.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. And things made by hand, he values that, right? That was one of the treasures, that she would make something for him and write to him, even though her handwriting was shaky and so on. He still treasured the letters that she wrote.
I thought the business-like hand was an interesting reference to perhaps what she did. Perhaps she was in some kind of business of some sort. I don't know, but I thought that was an interesting use of words to describe her handwriting.
He's a very deliberate observer, and Mary Oliver, one of my other favorite poets, is the same. She is a master at description. I think that Ted takes it further than just observing. He takes it to a deeper place. He asks or tells you about deeper questions, or deeper issues. And I'll read you his faith statement, as I said at the end of our time together. But he calls Jesus a godsend and says that he doesn't have to believe in all the miracles or understand all the parables to not know that Jesus was a godsend. That's sweet. Anything else about this poem that you noticed? This is one of the ones I have used at funerals and invited families, bereaved families, to think about or to speak about the legacy that they carry from the one who has died. Okay, let's move on to splitting in order. I like to watch an old man cutting a sandwich in half. Maybe an ordinary cold roast beef on whole wheat bread. No pickles or onion. Keeping his shaky hands steady by placing his forearms firm on the edge of the table. And using both hands, the left to hold the sandwich in place and the right to cut it surely, corner to corner. Observing his progress through glasses that moments before he wiped with his napkin, and then to see him lift half onto the extra plate he had asked the server to bring, and then to wait, offering the plate to his wife, while she slowly unrolls her napkin and places her spoon, her knife, and her fork in their proper places, then smooths the starch white napkin over her knees, and meets his eyes and holds out both old hands to him. This poem is, I think, another legacy for him. What did you notice in this poem?
Linda, would you like me to leave the poem up?
Sure, that's fine.
I was struck by the ending where she's holding out her hands to him.
Yeah.
It makes me think that maybe they're going to pray together.
That's a wonderful thought. He begins this poem with I think a phrase that's self-identifying for him. I am a man who likes to watch. I like to watch. And he is, in essence, looking at a mirror of himself, I think. He and his wife have been married for a long time. And here, again, we hear the imagery around aging. Shaky, old, you know.
Linda, each time I've read this poem, I found myself going through the actions. They're so specific, so descriptive, just kind of thinking about what he's doing, and arms on the table, holding the left hand holding, right hand cutting. It's just,
Yeah. Well, it's a deliberate action. And what strikes me, one of the things that strikes me about this poem is that the sharing is equal parts. He's doing it carefully so that nobody has less than. You remember when when kids were young and you told them they had to share, and whoever cut the piece, usually the bigger pie piece or whatever, got to choose last. So that they couldn't avoid sharing equally. Equal sharing is, it makes us think of Eucharist, or at least it makes me think of Eucharist. How is it that we, how is it that we share? But it can be more than just sharing a sandwich or a wafer of bread. It means filling the food pantries and paying attention to where the hungers are in the world. And are we deliberate as this central figure in the poem? Are we as deliberate about sharing and sharing equally? That's certainly part of the public discourse right now around issues of justice. And so I think that I think it's an important poem to sit with for a while. He wipes his glasses with a napkin. I love that. He thought ahead enough to ask the server to bring an extra plate. So it's a deliberate, all these actions are very deliberate. And he leaves us with the wife's, the image of the wife holding out her hands to him. And you know the next step, that he will take them. That the old man at the table will take those hands and hold them for as long as he can. So it's the life that they share for as long as they have it. And I think that that too is poignant and important. And one of the pieces that the pandemic has removed from us that I miss the most is being able to touch somebody, give them a hug, hold on to them for more than just a moment with my eyes. So, what do you think about no pickles, no onion? Why does he mention that? What is that all about?
Well, they're messy.
Yeah, they are messy.
It would make it harder to cut. He couldn't cut it.
Can you imagine little onions popping all over the room? Yeah.
I also think it creates sort of a pristine look on that plate. Ordinary cold roast beef on whole wheat bread.
Yeah.
Nothing in the periphery, just that single sandwich.
Yeah, I'd be waiting for my chips and the pickle.
Well,
I
and
think this,
Go ahead.
But that brings down to the part, and I have to say this, I saw myself in the wife, where you roll out this napkin, you line up your fork, your knife, and your spoon, and you don't need them because you have a sandwich. You don't need all of that. And I thought, oh my gosh, there I am at the restaurant, you know?
Yeah, the habits of a lifetime. That's what you do. That's how you take a moment to prepare for what you're going to be receiving. Yeah.
Somehow,
And I like that that's another deliberate action. Sylvia.
somehow for me, it gave the impression that maybe the wife was incapacitated in some way. And even though she rolled out the utensils, that was, say she was suffering from Alzheimer's, those may be automatic things that she would have done when she saw food. So she remembered that. So it puts him in the caregiver role, and I saw caring for her, long time habitual caring.
All right, that's a lovely thought.
Well, taking that to another place is what Sylvie just said, is that it's love in action. This whole thing is action, and it's all about love.
And his role, when he says, I like to watch, he's on the alert for those kinds of actions, and we are too. We're looking for kindness and compassion. We're looking for people who know what it is to take another's hand and walk across the street safely, or to look both ways, whatever it is. It's part of the human community, part of the human condition. And these are not values only from a place in the middle of the country. Anything else about this poem? I have a friend here, a couple. He's a retired bishop from, well, one of the provinces in Canada, and she's a lay theologian. Anyway, she said when she reads this poem, it makes her cry. Because he's much older than she is, and his health is not so great. But she's trying to take those meal times as precious, knowing that she will not have it forever. I think it's a sweet piece. So let's go to the last poem, and then I'll read some of Ted's words to you. The last poem is called Christmas Mail. Okay. Cards in each mailbox, angel, manger, star, and lamb. As a rural carrier driving the snowy roads, hears from her bundles the plaintive bleating of sheep, the shuffle of sandals, the clopping of camels. At stop after stop, she opens the little tin door and places deep in the shadows the shepherds and wise men, the donkeys lank and weary, and the cow who chews and muses. And from her styrofoam cup, white as a star and perched on the dashboard, leading her ever into the distance, there is a hint of hazelnut, and then a touch of myrrh. So we're out of season, of course, with this little poem. What did you think about it?
I was enchanted by the thought of a rural carrier holding each of those symbols and images of the Christmas story, and being the bearer, the almost like the Theotokos, like the God bearer, bringing that story to all the people on her route.
So that's an invitation to think about how we all bear the gospel.
Mm-hmm.
And where do we put it? Does it stay with us, or are we likely to extend what we know about those important stories? Are we likely to extend that to others? And how does that happen? How is it that we deliver the holy to each other, holding on to those bundles and then releasing them? So I imagine that the rural carrier is in this little mail truck, which we don't seem to see as often, opening all these little boxes. and bringing the greetings and the tidings of the season, but also bringing the gospel from those who sent it, those who sent those cards. And even though she can't see inside the envelopes, she hears what's in there.
It almost makes me think of when you're opening an Advent calendar with doors and you're revealing the story. That's what it makes me think of, with the mailboxes.
Yeah. Yeah.
And this is also her perception of what's in those cards. So this is her telling of the Christmas story.
Well,
Because
from the Gospel of Luke, anyway. Yeah.
she doesn't know what's in there. She's just, this is the story coming from the mind and the heart of a rural carrier. This is what she thinks she's carrying and sharing.
He makes a case for what we would call religious imagination. And Ignatius of Loyola, in the spiritual exercises, asked the retreatants to enter the scripture story and imagine themselves a part of it, and then to reflect on that in prayers and spiritual development. All poets, I think, are asking us to imagine being in the place where the focus of that poet's attention is. Imagine ourselves in the story. Imagine that we are like or unlike this perspective. But the use of religious imagination is very important to us, I think, beyond just the surface reading of the word. And that's why this poem is such a kind of sentimental, lovely piece.
Well, it strikes me that she had to know the gospel to think of it that way.
Yeah, yeah. What is it about the star on the dashboard?
It's guiding her, it's guiding the way.
Yeah, so that's unusual too, isn't it?
You mean that it's just a styrofoam cup?
Well, I think that the poet, I think Ted Kooser is imagining everyone in everybody's daily work, following some guidance or being led into a fuller appreciation of life and maybe of work.
It also seems like it's bringing the sacred and the ordinary, that they come together.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
For everybody.
What about the touch of myrrh? I get the hazelnut, that's in the coffee styrofoam star, but what about a touch of myrrh?
Is it just the reminder of the fragrance, the aromaticness of the frankincense, gold, frankincense, and myrrh? Is the epiphanal part of the story?
No,
Go ahead, Susan.
hi.
Hi.
Yes. No, myrrh is an myrrh is an embalming material. No, the cup, the thing we follow, is both rich and fragrant and includes death. I think that's what the message is there.
Yes, he's deliberately chosen something that is a reminder of death. And maybe he's anxious about the death of faith, or maybe he's always or constantly living with the perspective of death. I don't know what the date on this poem was, so I don't know if this has come out of that time when he's considering his mortality, but he is always considering his mortality. And myrrh as an embalming kind of gelatin or salve or whatever is also a preservative in some way. So for me, this ties back to the other poem that I chose for you, the legacy poem, and the splitting in order piece to a lesser extent. That life doesn't really go on forever. It ends and it changes. But there's a reminder here to pay attention, I think. Always from Ted Kooser, a reminder to pay attention. One year, I sent this out with my Christmas cards. I didn't get anybody's response back. It's one of my, maybe they went out and bought a book. I don't know. Who knows?
You know, back to the hazelnut and myrrh, I just saw a presentation yesterday on Julian of Norwich. And of course, I thought hazelnut, you know, all the world is in this nut that God loves and all shall be well and all of that. So I kind of thought, I don't know if he knew about that but it popped in my mind.
Yes, that's a good connection. It's possible. It's entirely possible. So is there anything else about this poem? I'm just going to end with some of his own words. He says, I'm far from being a traditional believer. That's because he went to the Unitarian Church in Lincoln, Nebraska for a long time because he liked the preacher, but it was 45 minutes away. And when that guy left and the other guy didn't use any literary quotations, he stopped going. So he goes to a small Episcopal church in Seward, which is about 14 miles away. And they've been members there for about 15 years. This is funny. I like the Episcopal liturgy, the formality, though I wish we could have kept the language of the King James Version. I will make you fish for people just doesn't do it, does it? So you get a sense of his sensibilities. I'm far from being a traditional believer, but I see myself as being a Christian because I subscribe to the good teachings of Jesus as to how we should treat each other. And I don't need the accounts or the miracles or resurrection to convince me that he was a godsend. I have been attending an Episcopal church and I bow to the great and ancient order of service. I participate. I take communion on my knees. I bend my head in common prayer, and each morning I read from the lectionary selection of Psalms and Scripture. And some of my friends say, how can you do that? Do you really believe all that stuff? The wine and bread, the body and blood of Christ and all that? His colleagues are also at the University of Nebraska where he teaches. My answer is I am caught up by and in the elaborate, complex, and beautiful Episcopalian vehicle. Engaged by it, just as any of us might be caught up by the imagery of a sonnet of Frost. The tenor of my religious experience is my sense that there is something there, beyond us and around us and within us, some great power. And my chosen church, with its beautiful vehicle, with its readings, its time-honored order of worship, its Eucharist, is my means of describing it, of recognizing it, of acknowledging it. There is something there, beyond us, around us, and within us. My faith is, as I see it, a vehicle, a kind of beautiful silken tent. And God is the tenor from which that vehicle lifts away. Any final comments before we release to worship in that beautiful Episcopal vehicle? Thank you all for showing up today, for listening to some of my favorite poems. I'm sure Catherine will tell you she has the books at the bookstore.
Indeed, we do.
And if you
Well,
have,
Mary Oliver.
and if you have other favorites, certainly let me know. He has plenty to feast on.
Thank you, Linda.
You're
Thank
welcome.
you so much, Linda.
Well,
It was just beautiful.
thanks. Well, I'm not as enthusiastic as Tim, you know, but I hope the invitation to savor these pieces was certainly my intent.
The recording will be on the website.